So this is the backing plate or brake dust shield for the driver's side, left side. Here's the part number. Went on Honda Parts Now, and with shipping it was like 89 bucks. So raise it on up. Well, if there's one thing that'll stop you dead in your tracks, it's not having the right size socket for the axle nut. So, the biggest I had was the 32, but 36 is what works for this puppy. So, make sure you get a 36 and not a 32. Now, I like to, since everything's still together, I like to pull the axle nut first. That way I can have the parking brake set and torque on it. So I just take a flathead screwdriver and a little hammer and take the dent out of the axle nut so I can free it up. Okay, just like that. Okay. I got my 36 millimeter and breaker bar, 1/2-inch drive. Let's see if this puppy comes off. She's seated, there she is. Okay, and just break the torque. Take off my axle nut, but before I do, I check to see if it's free, and it is. That's a good thing. Okay, last thing you gotta do before you release the parking brake is this little screw holds the rotor in place. You know, and sometimes they're tricky. Sometimes you want to put some oil on it, but just push hard in and gently turn to the left. And there she goes. Okay, out she comes. Now I release the parking brake. Okay, so I take a trusty 17 millimeter and I remove the mounting bolts from the brake caliper bracket. Here we go. So I'm just gonna do it this way. There you go. One. And two. 2 bolts. Whole assembly comes off intact. Put it up there. So with the screw out and the bracket off, the caliper bracket off, you just simply wiggle, and there you go. All right, just for reference, parking brake assembly, or your bearing, wheel bearing. Okay, we know the axle's loose, so now the fun begins. The shield I'm replacing is right here, this backing plate. They broke the shroud that goes around it, so I'm just going to replace the whole assembly. But to do that, I got to pull the rear wheel bearing, this puppy, which is held on by 4 bolts. And then I got to remove the parking brake assembly. So we'll start with the rear bearing first. But before I can do that, I got to remove the sensor. That's back here and goes down into it. The sensor is a 10 millimeter. And it looks, just go, let's see if we can, yeah, it comes out real easy. Down, gently remove, comes right out. There it is. That's your sensor. Okay, put that over here for now. There are no washers or anything I see to keep an eye on. I'll clean that up when I'm done before I put it back in. All right, so now all I have left is the 4 bolts on the back side that hold the rear bearing hub in there. Honda, I think, did it right. You remove the bolts and it pretty much separates from the housing without beating on it too bad. If that happens, life is good. We'll see. Okay, so the 4 bolts I talked about for the rear bearing. This is obviously underneath the truck, looking outward. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm gonna get a socket and pull those puppies. Okay, just loosened all 4 bolts. The top one required a shorter extension because the axle got in the way, so I'm going to pull them out. Okay, 4 bolts are out for the rear bearing. Came out really easy. I didn't need any lubricant or anything like that. What I like to do technique-wise, I will just gently scratch a little mark up top so I know where the top of the bearing is when I go to reinstall it. It's just technique. See what works for you. All right, so sensors out, bolts are removed. I did push on the back of the bolts, the head of the bolts, to see if there was any sort of movement. The bearing seemed to move a little bit, so that tells me it's not seized to the knuckle assembly. So hopefully it comes out. Look at that. All right, there's your knuckle, or there's your bearing. Pretty straightforward. I like that. I'm gonna clean that up. It's got a little bit of corrosion. Park and brake assembly is the next thing. It's no worse than a regular shoe, rear shoe brakes. It's very similar, if not identical, maybe a smaller version, it looks like. I never dealt with this type of piece before, so I'm going to be learning a little bit as I go. There's the star adjuster valve, spring on top, clips to retain it in place, 2 springs down here. What I like to do, because my memory is getting worse, I'll turn off the video and I'll take pictures of every piece of this before I tear into it. That way, when I go to put it back and I can't remember if the spring was this way or was it reversed, what holes it went in, what have you, you really can't screw it up. So I'm gonna turn off the camera and try that. Okay folks, before I tear into the brakes, you gotta clean them. All right, so get a tray, because this stuff gets real sticky. If you don't, it'll screw up your garage floor and you'll be hating life. So let's clean the brakes. All right, so we'll start at the top. I'm gonna pull the spring, pull the adjuster valve, the adjuster star valve there, and then pull the retention clips, and hopefully the whole assembly comes out in one shot. Now the thing to remember is your parking brake is on the bottom, so it's connected to it, so don't just think it's gonna fall all out. So we're gonna gently drop it down and put it out of the way, okay? I don't know if you guys have ever seen these, but these are called safety wire pliers. We used them in aviation maintenance because all the bolts and nuts had to be safety wired in place so they wouldn't back out in flight. These things are awesome. They got a square grabbing tip on the front. Let me see if I can show you up in the front. So they're much like regular pliers, except I think they're a lot stronger, and they give you a little bit more leverage working on stuff. Look at that. There you go. First spring out. Star valve out. I'm going to clean these later when we get everything apart. So guys, I've done brake shoes before. No, this can be a pain in the ass, but this really, all you got to do is kind of grab that middle tip, spin it, let it pop. All right, so gently drop this sucker down. There's the park and brake assembly, the cable. It's connected. Just kind of let it fall apart. Leave that in place. That's kind of a cool mechanism. It's got a pin. It comes right out. Okay, just boop. That's all it does, sit in there like that. Just make sure when it goes back, oops, make sure when it goes back, the pin is on the top so it doesn't fall out. It's kind of cool. I've never seen a mechanism like that. Interesting. Okay, we'll just put that back. Put that over here. Okay, so now we're down and dirty. Remember, the only thing really sticking out are retention clip or pin and the park and brake cable. So when it goes back together, we know how to do it. The last thing to do is there's 2 bolts right here, and I'll show you on the other plate. There's 2 bolts, right? So this is how the plate sits. 2 bolts. right back here, you got to pull those nuts off. I'm going to do that now. It's probably a 17 millimeter, I don't know. And then that whole assembly should come out and we'll get it cleaned up from then on. All right, so remember on the back of the backing plate, there are 2 bolts and 2 nuts. There's one there and there's one right next to it. They're both 17 millimeter. Once I get those off, then the backing plate should come out. By the way, here's the parking brake cable. So you don't have to mess with that one. That's bolted separately. So the back or the nuts are off here. Thing you got to remember is the pin and the cable should be sticking out like this. Brake cable when you go back on. So let's see what happens. Hey, look at that. Holy crap, mother of pearl. Okay, so in the name of preventative maintenance, we're going to clean up the inside here. Don't get crazy on it. It's very gentle, mild means of cleaning it out. You don't get crazy with. I've seen guys take Dremels to it. I'm not doing that. I'm going to use very soft means as possible. Probably a little bit of steel wool, but don't get crazy. You want those machine surfaces to stay where they were meant to be, so you don't want to grind stuff down and do any crazy stuff in there. Okay, I'll do that on that and on the wheel bearing itself just to clean it up. And again, just for comparison, you can see there's the old shield, there's the new. They broke the spot welds somehow, taking off the tire, who knows, and sticking out. Just got to remember that, because that's going to bite you if you don't. You won't be able to get it past this knuckle assembly if it's not in before you clamp it down. Fair warning. Okay, so this is after about 10-15 minutes of cleaning with steel wool, just gently going around, getting the corrosion off the bottom. Might have to touch up a little bit more, but it's amazingly cleaner than it was. As far as the back of the bearing assembly itself, I know to be very careful. This black ring around here, don't mess with this stuff. Just gonna try to gently clean around the outside, get rid of this corrosion over here, and not mess up the middle ring. So more to follow. All right, so everything's cleaned up. I cleaned up the knuckle, cleaned up as best I could, got rid of the corrosion down here. It all seemed obviously at the bottom because of the water. Obviously hangs out down there. I cleaned the bearing, very good. Now it's time to put the shield back on. So first thing you gotta remember is that stupid pin for the brake shoe, parking brake shoe, okay? Because if you get it on here and bolt it in place, you're gonna be heating life, because guess what? Now the knuckle's in the way and you'll never get that pin back in. All right, so shield's on. Those little parking brake bolts here, that actually holds it in place nicely, so I don't have to kill myself. So basically put the pins, or the brake shoe pins back in first, then put this on. Remember, you got your parking brake cable has to stick through, and then bolt said shield back in place. We'll start with these 2 bottom bolts back here, 17 millimeter. Okay, time to put everything back together now. Here we go. So first thing I notice is, remember that pin for the parking brake cable goes in the top and pushes in like that. Sits like this in the assembly. Okay, that's kind of cool. All right, let me put on the shoes. Next nightmare for any shoe is getting these freaking pins to come through and then collapsing the spring and flipping the little tab around so it sits in there just like that. Best way to do it, I found, take your channel lock pliers, also, hello also. I get everything staged and I put in the first tooth, I put the little cap and I quickly push it on and twist. And you know what? It's just boop, boop, and it goes. Just boop, boop, and it's done. Okay? Do it for both sides. Now, here's the funny braking piece. The braking, remember, we talked about the pin going up top so it doesn't fall out. Fold this little assembly in like this. So you get once you get the pins in, get the pads seated right on the little lugs there. You put this assembly right in there like that. Put this one in here like that. Notice the little ring or the little cutout here sits on the hub. That holds that in place. Now you got your spring. All right, so this is the fun part. Pulling the springs and getting them in the holes. Good luck. I don't know how to do it any better than anybody else. Here we go. There we go. Now, it's not in yet. There we go. Now she's in. Okay, that is half the battle right there. So, sometimes they go easy. Sometimes you need to go take a break and just walk away. Okay. So, star valve. A lot of guys will tear these things apart. Just spread them out. Make sure they're not rusted. This one's well lubricated. I'm going to screw it all the way in. And I think when it was originally set, it was something like that. So it's not that far of a gap. I do need to check my pictures to make sure I get the spring and the star valve in correctly. So I'll be right back. Really well. Notice the brake shoe. And the other thing I like about these is they can lock down. So now I can, like vice grips, I can hold on to that. Try and keep the orientation correct. There we go. Release. Boom. Okay, folks, so here's what I did. Put in the rear bearing. Very simply, I pushed it in, got it kind of flush, made sure the CV joint was sticking through, enough where I can get a nut on it. Okie dokie. The 4 bearing bolts are torqued down to 133 foot-pounds. That's fun to do under your car. Okay, anyway. So, remember the speed sensor? You gotta put that sucker back. All right, slid right in, no issues. Just make sure, wiggle the bolt a little bit. There we go. Get it started by hand. All right, just torque that down a little bit. Good to go. She's not going anywhere. Everything's back in place. Okay, folks, got the axle nut torqued and crushed it back down. Good to go there. Almost done here, so hang on. Next step, I'm gonna put on the brake caliper with the 2 bolts. There it is, undisturbed. Right back in there, like that. Okay, so I got the caliper bracket plate or bolts back in by hand. There's one's at the bottom there. There it is. So I'm going to torque those down and we'll be right back. Doing one final spot check. Make sure everything's where it should be. Okay, that's done on. Shield looks good. Sensors back in, bracket bolts are in, And the 4 mount bolts for the shield, backing plate, or torqued. So now we just put the tire back on, take it for a test drive.